Deep in the heart of the Ardennes, where the echoes of war still linger in the trees, there are places that time itself has forgotten. In the winter of 1944, the Battle of the Bulge left behind more than just scars in the land. It left the spirits of soldiers, trapped in an endless loop of war. They're the lost voices of the past, still fighting, still screaming, as if the war never truly ended. This is the story of those echoes, of soldiers who never left, and of a battle that continues to rage in the shadows of history. The ceasefire zone, whispers after the guns fell silent. The war had moved on, or at least that's what the orders said. In early January 1945, a small Allied infantry unit was deployed to a sector deep in the Ardennes forest, a place once scorched by the fury of the Battle of the Bulge. Snow still blanketed the pine trees in thick white silence, and the roads were lined with wreckage left behind from one of the most brutal clashes of the Western Front. The official mission was simple: establish a temporary forward post, patrol the area for any lingering threats, and prepare for a new line of defense. But for the men of the 39th Infantry Division, this assignment felt anything but routine. They called it the ceasefire zone, a quiet pocket of forest between two ridgelines where neither side had claimed victory. And while the maps no longer marked it as active combat territory, something in the air disagreed. Private James Harrington, a 22-year-old from Norwich, England, had served through Italy and southern France, but the silence in the Ardennes chilled him more than the fiercest artillery barrage ever had. It wasn't just the cold, he later wrote in a letter to his mother. It was the quiet. It was too quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. The men quickly noticed that no birds sang in this part of the forest. No animal tracks marked the snow. The only sound was the wind, and even that seemed reluctant to pass through the blackened trees. The pines, tall and skeletal, groaned occasionally under the weight of snow, but it was the kind of sound that felt more like a warning than nature. On their first night, Lieutenant Mason, the unit's commanding officer, called for radio silence. Not due to enemy threats, but because the static kept picking up strange interference. Whispering voices, clipped, desperate phrases. One voice, in a deep German accent, repeatedly said something unintelligible before fading into static. The communications officer, a young Belgian-American named Victor Dupont, tried to dismiss it as signal bouncing, atmospheric anomalies caused by the icy air. But some weren't so sure. Sergeant Doyle, a grizzled veteran from New Jersey, had a habit of walking perimeter duty alone. That night, he returned pale and shaken. He refused to speak of what he'd seen, only muttering, "They're not gone. They're still out there." When asked who he meant, he simply stared toward the trees. By the next morning, the mood of the unit had shifted. Jokes died in throats. Conversations were brief and uneasy. Even the campfire, which had once been a comfort, now seemed to cast long, unnatural shadows into the forest beyond. Harrington began sketching what he called shapes in the fog, half-formed figures he claimed to see just beyond the tree-line at dusk. They never moved, never made a sound, but they were there, watching. One sketch showed a soldier, helmet askew, rifle broken, staring blankly toward the camp. Corporal Miller, tasked with night watch, swore he heard footsteps crunching in the snow, just outside the light of the perimeter lamps. When he called out, there was no answer. But the footsteps continued, pacing the camp, until suddenly they stopped. Completely. They found nothing the next day. No prints. No signs of wildlife. Nothing but a growing sense that they weren't alone. One of the engineers discovered an old, half-destroyed foxhole along a shallow ridge. Inside were frozen scraps of parchment, burned at the edges. He pulled out what appeared to be a page from a field journal. The ink had run, but a few lines remained legible, written in German. Wir kämpfen noch. Der Wald vergisst nicht. We are still fighting. The forest does not forget. By the end of the second day, a decision was made to double the guard shifts. Not because of fear of the enemy, but because the men were beginning to fear the forest itself. The war might have moved on, but something had stayed behind. Phantom sounds in the snow, the first night. The first night in the ceasefire zone was colder than expected. A brittle wind swept through the pines, cutting through the soldiers' thick coats and burning their cheeks red. The forest seemed to absorb the fire's warmth rather than reflect it, as if the air itself was hollow and hungry. At 0:13 hours, Private Miller, still assigned to night watch, radioed in a disturbance. He thought he'd heard something beyond the ridge. Not footsteps this time, but gunfire, muffled and distant, like it came from deep underground or from a place just out of reach. Lieutenant Mason dismissed it as echoes from distant artillery, perhaps testing or residual booms carried by wind. But 15 minutes later, 2 more soldiers confirmed hearing it too. Not just gunfire now, but screaming. Men screaming in pain. Orders being shouted in both English and German. And somewhere in the chaos, the shrill sound of a whistle, followed by silence. The unit's medic, Corporal Elias Kruger, a Dutchman from Rotterdam, stepped outside the tent to investigate. He had heard war. He'd heard death. But what he heard that night wasn't right. It wasn't current. It was recorded almost faint, decayed, like the forest was replaying an old horror through a broken gramophone. When he returned to the tent, his hands were shaking. "I heard someone yelling for help," he said, eyes wide. In Dutch. I think he said my name. That same night, Private Harrington awoke in a panic. He had been sleeping in his bunk when he swore someone grabbed his foot and pulled hard. But when he sat up, the tent flap was still closed and everyone else was asleep. No tracks in the snow. No sign of forced entry. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Not by animals or enemies, but by something else entirely. Something buried deep within the land. He described the sensation in his journal as being weighed down by memories that weren't mine. Just before dawn, the fog rolled in, thick, unnatural, greenish-gray. It didn't drift like normal fog, but clung low to the forest floor in strange, pulsing clouds. Visibility dropped to a few feet, and the silence deepened into something oppressive. Time itself seemed to slow down. Then came the thunder. It was not real thunder. It was rhythmic like shell fire. The forest lit up for a brief second, just enough for a few men to spot shadows darting between the trees. Not running, but moving methodically, as if advancing in formation. The men scrambled to position, weapons drawn. Mason shouted orders, trying to identify the threat. But the moment passed. The fog lifted. The lights were gone, and everything returned to stillness. Morning patrol reported nothing unusual. No tracks, no signs of enemy presence, no wildlife. Just the lingering scent of gunpowder in the air, and one strange detail, a single metal whistle, German make, partially frozen into the snow near the ridge. It was old, tarnished, cracked from age, but it hadn't been there the day before. Kruger picked it up. His face went pale. This is standard issue for Wehrmacht officers in 1944. Exactly like the one my grandfather carried. But this one, he added quietly, has my family name scratched into the side. That night, no one spoke around the fire. Harrington stopped sketching. Miller refused perimeter duty. Even Mason, a hardened veteran of 2 major campaigns, looked uneasy. Something was happening in the ceasefire zone. And for the first time since landing in Europe, the men felt like the war wasn't just behind them. It was waiting. The frozen soldier, apparition in the pines. The sun barely rose the next morning. More of a dim glow behind thick, gray clouds than any real light. Snow had fallen again in the night, erasing all traces of footprints and gear movements. The forest stood as it had for centuries, cold, silent, and watching. Private Harrington had stopped sleeping. After the incident with the tug at his foot, he took to pacing the camp at night with his rifle slung over one shoulder and a flashlight in his hand. He didn't trust what he saw in the dark, but he trusted what he didn't see even less. That morning, he volunteered to join Sergeant Doyle and Corporal Kruger on a perimeter sweep, hoping that moving through the woods might help clear the paranoia that had built in his chest like ice. They walked slowly through the snow, boots crunching softly, eyes scanning the forest for anything out of place. That's when Harrington saw him. Roughly 40 meters ahead, half hidden by a snow-covered pine, stood a man. He was facing away, still and silent, wearing a grayish uniform that had no markings they could identify at that distance. The shape of his helmet was unmistakable, the sloped steel bowl of the Wehrmacht. A rifle was slung over one shoulder, shattered at the stock as if hit by shrapnel. His stance was relaxed, eerily so, like he was waiting for something. "Contact," Doyle whispered, raising his weapon. "Don't shoot," Kruger said quietly, lowering the barrel. "He's not moving." They began to flank the figure. Harrington approached from the left, boots sinking into the snow, heart pounding so hard it hurt. He took slow, careful steps, flashlight beam trained on the soldier's back. The light caught a shimmer of frost on a man's collar. Then the figure turned. His face was pale, translucent almost. The eyes were vacant, cloudy, like glass fogged over with death. His mouth was slightly open, as though in mid-sentence, but no sound emerged. The soldier looked straight at Harrington, and for a moment, neither moved. Then the figure vanished. Instantly. No footsteps. No fading. 1 second he was there, the next gone. The only thing that remained was a faint patch of disturbed snow where he had stood. Doyle ran forward, breath visible in the freezing air. "You saw that, right?" Harrington nodded, his hands trembling. "That wasn't a man. That was something else." They searched the immediate area and found no tracks, only a strange indentation in the snow. It didn't look like a boot print. It looked like someone had been pressed into the snow from above and then lifted out without walking away. Kruger knelt by a tree near the site and brushed snow off a piece of fabric caught on a broken branch. It was Wehrmacht field gray, worn, frozen stiff. Embedded in the corner of the torn cloth was a rusted insignia, barely legible, but enough to identify it as part of a German winter coat used during the winter of 1944. They returned to camp in silence. No one cracked a joke. No one offered theories. That night, Harrington drew the soldier's face. In the sketch, the ghost's eyes were dark, empty sockets, and his mouth was frozen in what looked like a silent scream. On the back of the drawing, Harrington wrote one word, "trapped." When he showed the sketch to Kruger, the medic grew pale. "This is impossible," he said. "That looks like my uncle. He went missing here in '44. My family never found his body." Doyle looked up from cleaning his rifle and muttered, "Maybe he never left." Later that evening, the wind picked up, howling through the camp. Somewhere in the distance, from the same direction the ghost had appeared, they all heard it, clear and unmistakable. A voice, yelling in German. One word repeated again and again, echoing through the pines like a broken record. "Zurück, zurück, zurück. Go back, go back." The Forgotten Journal, words from the past. 2 days after the ghostly encounter in the woods, the unit received orders to dig in and fortify the abandoned buildings nearby, a cluster of half-ruined stone houses that once belonged to a small Belgian farming hamlet. The village had no name on the map anymore, just coordinates, and even the locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed ground. The houses were silent ruins, walls scarred by gunfire, windows shattered, doors blasted from hinges. But inside, they found no signs of recent life, only the cold weight of history lingering like dust in the air. Private Harrington and Corporal Kruger were assigned to clear out the largest structure, a stone farmhouse with a burned-out roof and a collapsed chimney. It was filled with debris, charred wood, splintered furniture, and in one corner, the twisted remains of a piano. Oddly, one single key still worked. When pressed, it released a haunting, broken note that echoed unnaturally through the empty space. While clearing out the cellar, Kruger's shovel hit something hard. Not stone, not metal, but something with corners. He knelt and brushed the dirt away to reveal a small, leather-bound book, its cover singed and edges frozen stiff. It had been buried beneath a broken floorboard, wrapped in a piece of canvas. They brought it into the daylight and slowly opened it. The handwriting was neat, crisp, unmistakably German. A field journal. The first few pages recorded logistics, rations, movements, weather conditions. Then, after December 17th, 1944, the eve of the battle, the entries changed. The tone became erratic. The handwriting more frantic. One entry read, "Too much snow. We're ghosts already." The men speak of voices in the night, cries from beyond the fog. We are not the only ones here. Something else watches us. Further in, the writer described losing soldiers, not in combat, but as if they vanished, disappeared during patrols. One note read, "Bauer went to relieve himself near the tree line. We heard him scream, but when we reached the spot, only his helmet was left, warm to the touch." Then, the most chilling entry of all. It was dated January 2nd, 1945. I saw my own face today, in the fog, watching me from the trees. It smiled and whispered, "We're sin nicked for it. We are not gone." The last page was stained with what looked like dried blood. A smeared handprint marred the final words. "This place remembers, even if no one else does." Kruger translated aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. By the time he finished, a small group of soldiers had gathered around, silent, listening as if the book were a sacred relic. Doyle crossed himself. "That's not just a journal," he said. "That's a warning." Later that day, Lieutenant Mason requested a search of the property's basement. He wanted to know if there were any tunnels, hiding places, or signs of enemy activity. The men complied, but the basement revealed nothing, except for one strange marking carved into the stone wall. It was a crude circle. Inside, the silhouette of a soldier's helmet, surrounded by radiating lines, like a sun or explosion. Beneath it, a single word etched in sharp, violent strokes. Gefangen. Trapped. That night, Harrington added another sketch to his journal, this time of the strange symbol and the eerie figure he'd seen earlier in the forest. His drawing showed the ghost standing beneath the same sunburst emblem, its face half human, half decayed. The air that night felt heavier, not just cold, but oppressive. The fog returned, thicker than ever, crawling low to the ground like it was searching for something. Some of the men refused to sleep indoors and instead built a fire outside, preferring the bitter cold over the claustrophobic silence of the walls. The journal was placed under lock and key, but the men could feel it, even when hidden, as if the book had absorbed the emotions of its writer, as if it remembered every word ever spoken within its pages. And worse, perhaps it wanted to be read again. The repeating battle, history in a loop. It began with flashes of light. At precisely 2:17 a.m., two soldiers on watch, Privates Lang and Boudreau, reported what they believed was an incoming artillery strike in the valley, just beyond the ridgeline. Bright, sharp bursts lit up the forest like lightning. But there was no sound, no tremor, just the surreal shimmer of explosions in complete silence. Lieutenant Mason was roused immediately, along with Sergeant Doyle and Corporal Kruger. They rushed to the observation point. The lights continued, irregular bursts, some lasting only a second, others lingering like flares. They seemed too bright to be natural, too rhythmic to be accidental. Then, faintly at first, came the sounds. Gunfire, screams, whistles, the thunder of boots stomping through snow. But the sounds didn't match the light. The timing was wrong. Gunfire rang out after the flashes, not during. Screams echoed before the explosions. It was as if the very timeline of the battle was broken, fractured into pieces, replaying out of order. The men took cover instinctively, expecting shells to land. But none came. Just more light, more sound, more chaos with no origin. Kruger whispered, "It's the same as the journal described the echoes. This battle is stuck." Repeating. For the next 3 nights, the phenomenon returned. At the exact same hour, the lights would come. Then the sounds, always in the same sequence, always fading away before dawn. By the 5th night, some of the men began to lose sleep, unsure if what they were witnessing was real or some kind of shared madness. But then came the most disturbing twist. The positions of the flashes began to change, moving closer to the encampment. What had once appeared distant and isolated now seemed to be approaching, step by step, as if the phantom battle was drawing closer, reenacting its fatal choreography toward the exact ground the soldiers were camped on. Private Harrington noticed it first. "They're following a path," he said. "The same path our unit was ordered to patrol, like we're retracing something." The following morning, a trench was discovered, not dug by the current unit, but older. Much older, nearly filled with snow and collapsed in places. Inside were fragments of gear, rotted leather straps, rusted canteens, the remains of a tattered field pack with the initials GK scrawled in ink, nearly faded to nothing. Kruger froze when he saw it. "That's my grandfather's name," he said quietly. They brought the items back to camp. Kruger confirmed the initials matched letters he'd seen in his grandmother's attic. His grandfather had served in the Ardennes and had gone missing in action in January 1945. Never found, never recovered. Later that night, the men gathered around the fire, exhausted but too afraid to sleep. Then they heard it, clearer than ever before. Voices shouting in panic, desperate commands barked in both German and English. A scream, cut short, then the unmistakable, slow crunch of someone marching through snow. Only no one was there. Sergeant Doyle grabbed his rifle and scanned the tree line with a floodlight. For just a moment, everyone saw them. Rows of soldiers, ghostly, transparent, marching past in formation. Their uniforms flickered between German and Allied. Their faces were a blur. They moved through the trees, not disturbing a single branch, their weapons frozen to their chests like they were sleepwalking through history. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone, as if the scene had played out and faded like an old reel of film. Harrington broke the silence with a whisper. "It's not just a memory. It's a performance, one they're forced to repeat." Mason, still staring into the trees, muttered, "The Battle of the Bulge never ended here. Not for them." And then the last voice came, alone, distant, but terrifyingly clear. A young soldier, screaming the same words over and over in English. "It's not over. It's not over. We're still here." The missing patrol lost to the echo. The orders were straightforward. Send out a 3-man patrol to scout the lower valley at dawn. The purpose was to investigate a strange light reported by the night watch, brief and flickering, like a lantern moving slowly through the mist. It was likely nothing, a reflection, a firefly caught in the cold. That's what Mason told himself when he gave the assignment. Privates Shaw, Kowalski, and Brunner were chosen. They were experienced, alert, and trusted not to spook easily. Each was equipped with standard winter gear, a rifle, a flare gun, and a compass. They never came back. By mid-morning, when the sun had failed to rise beyond a dull gray haze, Mason sent out a search team. They followed the patrol's trail into the valley. The snow bore their tracks for a while, straight and clean. But roughly 100 meters past the edge of the forest, the footprints simply stopped. No blood, no scuffle, no retreat. Just 3 sets of boots that had walked forward and then vanished into the snow, as if swallowed by the earth itself. Doyle crouched down, his breath visible in the cold air. "No storm could cover tracks this clean," he said. "It's like they were lifted out of here." Kruger, inspecting nearby brush, found something half buried under the snow. An old ammunition box, rusted and marked with faded German stenciling. It dated back to the winter of 1944. But it wasn't just the age that startled him. It was always inside. 3 rusted helmets. 1 American, 2 German, each with a bullet hole. No skulls, no blood, just decay. They brought the helmets back for inspection. Inside the American one, scratched faintly along the inner lining, was a name, J. Shaw, the same name as one of the missing men. But this helmet was clearly decades old, worn, eaten by rust. How could it carry the name of a man still breathing that very morning? Back at the farmhouse, the mood shifted from concern to dread. Harrington sat near the fire, staring into nothing, mumbling to himself. He finally spoke up. "The patrol isn't missing. They've been pulled into the echo." When asked what he meant, he explained a theory that had begun forming in his mind since reading the German journal. This forest is not just haunted, it's fractured, like it exists in multiple times at once. The men didn't disappear, they crossed over. Doyle didn't like it. Into what? A ghost story? But no one laughed. Not this time. That night, the fog returned, thicker than ever. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that screams in the back of your skull. Then came the voices. 3 of them. Male. English. calling for help. "We're here. Can anyone hear us?" "Lieutenant Mason, it's Shaw. We're still out here." The men scrambled outside, flashlights sweeping the woods. But they found nothing. Only snow, fog, and a strange distortion in the air, like heat waves rising from frozen ground. Then, from the ridge, they saw them. 3 figures, blurred by mist, walking along the tree line in a slow, trance-like state. Their movements didn't match the terrain, as if their feet weren't touching the ground. Their uniforms shimmered between new and old, clean and torn. Weapons slung over their shoulders like phantoms from another time. Kruger shouted their names. No response. He fired a flare. The light rose, burst in a red bloom, then flickered, glitched like a broken reel of film. When it cleared, the figures were gone. They searched again in the morning. Found nothing. No tracks. No flares. No patrol. Only one chilling reminder. The same ammunition box from the day before, now placed on the doorstep of the farmhouse. This time, the helmets inside were different. 3 helmets, all modern, all belonging to the missing men, still bearing the fresh warmth of human touch, still dripping from the snow, but with no snow falling that day. Whispers from the trenches, calling the living. The forest had grown quieter, but the silence was not comforting. It was oppressive, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting. The men of the 39th Infantry Division had endured days of confusion, fear, and ghostly encounters, yet something still lingered in the air. Something they couldn't name, but could all feel. It was on the 7th night that the whispers began. Private Lang, who had been on edge since the disappearance of the patrol, was the first to hear it. He had been on sentry duty, staring into the mist, where he thought he heard his name called out softly through the wind. At first, he thought it was just the sound of the trees groaning in the cold. But then again, Lang, his heart skipped. He turned quickly, scanning the dark expanse of the forest behind him. But there was nothing, only the gentle sway of the trees in the wind. No movement, no sound. He dismissed it, trying to chalk it up to nerves. But then it happened again. A voice, clear as day, right behind him. "Lang, come here." The voice was familiar. Too familiar. His mother's voice. Lang jerked around, rifle in hand. His eyes scanned the trees. The forest remained still, the mist swirling around the trunks like fog seeping from a forgotten past. He stepped backward, the ground crunching beneath his boots. A cold sweat broke out across his brow as he heard it once more, but this time louder, more urgent. "Lang, come back to us." The voice wasn't his mother's at all. It was his own, calling from somewhere deep in the forest, echoing through the trees. The words felt like a rope, pulling at him, urging him to leave the camp and follow. He was shaking now, the rifle still clutched in his hands. He staggered back to the perimeter and grabbed Corporal Kruger by the arm, pulling him toward the trees. "There's someone out there," Lang gasped. "I hear them calling my name." Kruger, ever the skeptic, looked in the direction Lang pointed, but saw nothing. "It's just the wind, Lang. You've been out here too long. Get some rest." But Lang couldn't. Something gnawed at him deep in his gut. As much as he wanted to believe it was the wind, the voice was too real. He had heard it, and had called his name. That night, the whispers spread. Soldier after soldier reported hearing voices. Whispers so soft they were barely audible, yet unmistakable. Some heard their own names, others the names of comrades who had been killed in earlier engagements. All the voices carried the same pleading tone, the same urgency. "Come back. We need you. We're waiting." Harrington was among the most affected. He couldn't shake the feeling that the war was not over, that it had never truly ended. The voices seemed to echo his own thoughts, his fears that the souls of the soldiers, both living and dead, were bound to the land, unable to move on. The whispers seemed to come from the trenches, empty, forgotten relics of past battles. They whispered not just in the night, but during the day as well. The soldiers would sometimes stop mid-conversation, startled by the familiar calls drifting from the wreckage of old foxholes, as if the past was reaching out, pulling them in. One afternoon, Doyle and Kruger decided to investigate. They made their way toward a set of trenches that had been dug during the battle, now abandoned and filled with snow. As they walked, they heard it, a faint voice calling from the bottom of the trench. Doyle! The name echoed, growing louder as they approached. They followed the sound, finding a section of trench where the snow had been disturbed. In the snow, they found a fresh imprint of boots, not their own. The footprints led to a patch of earth that looked softer, as though something had recently been buried there. Kruger knelt down and uncovered a half-buried wooden box. Inside, they found several old photographs, some of soldiers in full uniform, others of civilians. But there was one photograph that made both men freeze. It was a picture of Doyle, taken years before the war. It had been placed in the box, along with the other mementos. His face stared up at them, eyes wide, trapped in time. A handwritten note was tucked inside the photo, scrawled in German. "We never left." The realization hit both men like a hammer. These were not just echoes of war. The voices weren't random. They were the voices of soldiers who had fought, bled, and died in the same places they now stood. The past had become an unshakable presence, reaching across time and space, dragging the living into its eternal loop. As they turned to leave, they heard it again. The whisper, clearer this time, seemed to come from the very earth beneath their feet. "It's not over. It will never end." The Belgian farmer, keeper of the secret. The day after the whispers in the trench, a bitter wind swept through the forest, forcing the men to take shelter earlier than usual. Supplies were low, morale lower still. No enemy had attacked them, yet every man felt like he was under siege by something unseen. Lieutenant Mason ordered a brief expedition to a nearby village. The plan was simple: secure extra rations, check in with any locals for intelligence, and give the soldiers a temporary break from the eerie silence of the woods. The village, Stavelot, was barely inhabited now, just a scattering of aging stone homes and smoke curling from a chimney or two. The residents were few and wary, but one man, an elderly farmer named Matthew Van Acker, welcomed the soldiers inside his modest cottage. Matthew was a weathered man with deep-set eyes and hands that looked carved from oak. He offered them warm tea and sat by the fire while Mason explained their presence in the nearby forest. When they mentioned the strange lights, the missing men, and the voices, Matthew grew still. "I was there," he said in a hoarse voice, "when the battle tore through these woods. I was a boy then, 12. We fled to the church, but I remember the sounds. Screams, fire, men crying for their mothers. Some died right outside this door." Kruger leaned in, asking, "Have you ever heard anything since then?" Matthew gave a hollow laugh. "Heard? No, I've felt them. Every winter when the snow returns. You can smell the smoke again, hear the crunch of boots. Some nights, I see the lights moving through the trees like they never stopped fighting." Harrington asked, "Why didn't you leave?" The old man looked at the window toward the edge of the trees. "Because someone has to remember." Then he told them something none of them expected. He described a spot deep in the forest, a clearing that no bird ever flew over, where even deer avoided the ground. A place locals called the WWII, the Valley of Silence. "Many men died there," he said, "but some didn't die right away. They screamed into the fog, lost in the trenches. Some say their souls never found the end of the battle, that the forest refused to give them up." Kruger frowned. "You believe that?" "I don't believe," Matthew said softly. "I know." He stood and walked to a cabinet. From it, he retrieved a small, locked wooden box. Inside was a faded armband, red and white, belonging to the Belgian resistance. Alongside it was a map, hand-drawn, the ink smudged by time and use. It detailed the area around the Allied encampment, including a path that led to the Valley of Silence. "There," he said, pointing, "that's where you'll find them." "Find who?" Mason asked. Matthew's eyes narrowed. "The men who never left." Before they departed, he gave them one final warning. "If you hear someone calling your name from the forest, don't answer. Even if it's your brother, even if it's your own voice. Some things want company, and they lie to get it." The walk back was quiet. No one spoke, not even Doyle, who usually had a cynical remark for everything. Each man held the old farmer's words close, as if they were the last bit of guidance they'd ever receive. That night, Harrington opened his sketchbook and added a new drawing. An old farmhouse lit only by a dying fire, and in the distance, the edge of the forest where ghostly soldiers waited beyond the tree line. Under the sketch, he wrote, "Someone has to remember. The time echo, a rift in reality." The soldiers returned from Stavelot different, quieter, more contemplative. The old farmer's words clung to their thoughts like frosted glass. And while they didn't speak of it openly, most of them had begun to believe it. They weren't just experiencing strange events. They were inside something. Lieutenant Mason reviewed the map Matthew had given them again and again. The hand-drawn path to the Valley of Silence was marked in precise detail, an old trail long since overgrown. He authorized a recon team to investigate it, this time bringing Corporal Kruger and Private Harrington with him. As they entered the forest's deeper edge, the air grew unnaturally still. No birds, no wind. The snow underfoot seemed to muffle even their own thoughts. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from weight, but from time itself, as if they were walking backward into something forgotten. Then they found it, a circular clearing surrounded by blackened, dead trees. The snow inside was untouched, perfect, but the temperature dropped immediately, and their breath-formed clouds that froze mid-air. In the center stood what once might have been a communications post, now collapsed, covered in ivy and ice. Mason approached it slowly and crouched beside an old field telephone. It was still intact, but covered in frost. As a strange instinct, he picked up the receiver. There was a click, then static, then voices. Not from the forest, from the phone. At first, it was garbled, then clearer. Men yelling, explosions. The unmistakable sound of someone screaming coordinates over radio waves. The sounds of the Battle of the Bulge, alive, unfolding in real time, through a device that should have long since stopped working. Then the static stopped. A single voice came through, whispering in German. Wiederholen, wiederholen. Repeat, repeat. Mason dropped the receiver. The air thickened. Harrington stepped backward, flashlight beam flickering, then completely failing. The light died in his hand, and with it, the sound of time seemed to vanish too. They stood in silence, until something else began. A strange vibration passed through the ground. Low, subtle. Then across the clearing they saw it. A glitch in the world. The best way Harrington could describe it later was like watching an old film reel unravel in front of them. The forest beyond the clearing distorted, wavered, looped. A squad of ghostly soldiers suddenly emerged from the tree line, guns drawn, faces screaming. But they didn't attack. They ran forward in terror, and then the entire scene reversed, playing backward in a flicker of unnatural speed. Then it happened again. The soldiers advanced, screamed, collapsed, then reversed. Again and again. A loop. A battle repeating itself in a permanent fracture of time. Kruger stepped closer to the edge of the clearing, mesmerized. "It's a recording," he whispered, "but not one we're watching. We're inside it." Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet cracked with a sharp snap. He fell to his knees, then vanished. Mason screamed his name. Harrington rushed to the spot, only to find no hole, no disturbance. Kruger was simply gone, just like the patrol, just like the others. Mason dropped to his knees and clawed at the snow with his gloves, revealing something underneath. Another rusted helmet, half buried. It was Kruger's, still warm. Back at camp, Harrington sat alone, staring into the distance. He said nothing, but he began to draw obsessively. His sketches no longer showed just ghosts or soldiers. They showed broken clocks, splintered compasses, and scenes of battles bleeding into each other, like different wars colliding in the same frame. He handed one to Mason without a word. At the bottom, he had written, "Time is the battlefield now." The last charge, a storm of ghosts. The fog came earlier than usual that night. Thick, rolling, chilling. It poured in from the trees like a living thing, wrapping itself around the encampment, blotting out stars and snuffing the moon. Visibility dropped to nothing. Radios failed. Compasses spun aimlessly. The soldiers clustered close to the fires, rifles ready. but no one truly knew what they were bracing for. Lieutenant Mason stood outside the farmhouse, staring into the void beyond the tree line. Harrington stood beside him, sketchbook in hand, though he wasn't drawing anymore. He was watching, listening. Then, without warning, the forest screamed. It started as a low, distant rumble, like thunder, but deeper. A sound not just heard, but felt, in the bones, in the ground, in the chest. Then came the stomping, rhythmic, dozens, hundreds of boots pounding through snow. Harrington turned toward the sound and whispered, "They're coming." The fog pulsed, then erupted in flashes of light. Not lightning, not flares, muzzle flashes. From the darkness, shapes emerged. Dozens, then hundreds. Figures in tattered uniforms, faces twisted in pain or rage, charging forward in absolute silence. German soldiers, American soldiers. Some carried rifles, others bayonets. One dragged the remains of a radio strapped to his back. But none of them were alive. They passed through trees, through barricades, through firelight itself. Ghostly, transparent, but impossibly real. Their screams came not from their mouths, but from the air around them, as if the forest was exhaling their final moments in a single, horrifying breath. The men panicked. Some shouted, some prayed, some simply froze. Doyle fired. The bullet passed through a ghostly officer who vanished on contact. Mason screamed for the men to hold position, but the soldiers kept coming, running, bleeding, dying again and again. A charge not toward the enemy, but toward release. Amid the chaos, Harrington stepped forward, his face calm, eyes distant. He dropped his rifle, reached into his coat, and pulled out the journal they'd recovered, the one written by the long-dead German soldier. Its pages fluttered wildly in the wind, glowing faintly. He opened the final page. "It's the same moment," he muttered, over and over. "The last charge. They're stuck in it." He walked into the fog. Mason shouted after him, but it was too late. As Harrington disappeared into the sea of phantoms, something changed. The battle slowed. The screams softened. The fog began to thin, as if the air itself had taken a breath. Then everything stopped. No wind, no sound, and no ghosts. The forest stood silent. Still, normal almost. The rest of the unit emerged from the farmhouse, stunned, weapons lowered. The campfires flickered back to life. The static on the radio cleared. The compasses began to point north again. Harrington was gone. Kruger was gone. Shaw, Kowalski, Brunner, all gone. But so were they. The trapped soldiers. The endless loop. The echo. Mason stood alone in the clearing where Harrington had vanished. The journal still lying in the snow. On its final page, in handwriting that hadn't been there before, was a single sentence, written in English. "Let them rest." By dawn, the fog had lifted entirely. No more voices. No more footsteps in the dark. No more spectral battles playing out across fractured time. Just snow, cold, silence, and peace. Back at headquarters, the commanding officers asked for a report. Mason gave them a simple one. No enemy activity. Valley secured. One casualty. One missing. He said nothing about the ghosts. Nothing about the whispers, or the time loops, or the storm of souls that had poured through the trees. No one would believe it anyway. But late that night, in a quiet room lit only by candlelight, Mason opened the journal one last time. And from deep in the forest, carried on the faintest breeze, he thought he heard Harrington's voice. Not screaming, just saying goodbye. The soldiers who fought in the Battle of the Bulge may have left the field of battle, but their stories, their echoes, remain woven into the very fabric of the forest. Some say that the war is never truly over, that it lives on in the memories of the fallen. As we move forward, we carry their voices with us. Reminders that even in the silence, the past is never truly gone. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the unseen, the unexplained, and the unforgettable. Until next time, remember, some echoes never fade.